overhaul of the underlying foreign aid law since 1986. Congress passes this defense authorization every year. The last time they did it for foreign aid was 1986. And so we have a lot of underbrush that messes up our ability to conduct foreign aid, foreign economic policy. So there's a lot we have to do.
You've mentioned a couple times the imbalance that you see in like conceptions of service, where like people hold military service in such high regard that there is popular demand for a NDAA to be passed every year. If that didn't happen, there would be problems for members of Congress. Whereas with these other government agencies and public servants, that isn't really the case. Is that kind of...
Well, in fact, the only legal problem that would occur if a defense authorization bill were not enacted is that you couldn't change the level of military compensation higher than the inflation rate. That's all. But in fact, the stakeholders, the folks on the committees of jurisdiction say, we've got to do a bill, and they do a bill. And the leadership says, yes, we've got to spend the time to do it. Leadership doesn't want a foreign aid bill to take up 2 weeks of congressional time. And that's part of the problem, that the Congress can't restrain itself from offering poison pill amendments on God knows what. If it's a foreign aid bill, because who cares if it passes or not? That mentality, I think, is the real explanation for the problem there.
I wanted to turn really quickly to what we were just talking about in regard to how a lot of members of Congress are worrying about the effect of one vote and how that's going to affect their future elections and future campaigns. I think it would also help if the American public could better hold their members of Congress to task. And if they're more educated about issues like the military and defense policy, they'd do a better job at holding their members of Congress to task. Do you think Congress has any role in educating the American public about the military?
Oh, sure. And I think Congress should use the kinds of regular order debates that we have every year on armed service, on DOD, on armed services matters, to do that. I think they have. Senator McCaskill described her work on sexual harassment policies. I thought that was very excellent, where she was trying to get information, discussing with all of the potential stakeholders, what are the facts and what's the best way to respond to it. Whether the media pays attention to some of these lower profile investigations and issues is a different matter. It's much easier for the media to pay attention to casualties and problems than to slower, sensible reform.
So that congressional oversight, by its very nature, is a way to educate the public about the military.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So one thing that we've seen kind of in recent years is an interaction between things and missions, even that are classified as sensitive. And, there was the attack in Niger that happened last year, and there were members of the Senate Intelligence Committee who came and said they didn't even know we had troops in Niger, right? And so there's been things that have been like kept out of the public knowledge for, whatever national security reasons. On the other hand, there's the issues of oversight and transparency and accountability. What do you kind of make of that interaction?
Well, I have some personal background in this whole issue because I helped write the law, which is basically still on the books, that says the CIA cannot conduct covert actions unless the president personally approves and the Congress is notified. That, I think, is the template, the good template for offensive cyber operations, for lethal drone strikes, as well as the kinds of things that the missions that you're talking about that are sensitive. Not the train and assist that's done by the Defense Department under Title 10, but these clandestine operations that are done under Title 50, where the intelligence community's rules are set. So I guess Niger was not a covert operation. It was an open one, and people should have just known and been careful about that. But if sensitive operations are being conducted, I think you should follow the model called the Hughes-Ryan Act that I was involved in, that I think has worked in for the last several decades.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
Turning toward the future of what congressional oversight looks like, do you think it's possible for Congress to regain that authority that it has ceded?
Well, it has to in a wide range. We've discovered recently that the Congress ceded authority in '76 on national emergencies, and President Trump is using that law, just as he used earlier provisions in the trade laws to impose sanctions that appear questionable under the normal reading of what that law was supposed to allow. So Congress has given over the years a lot of power without worrying about it. I think there's a sense now, certainly in the trade area already, legislation is moving that might limit the president's authority there. On military operations, I think the Congress is ready to impose limits. After all, the War Powers Act was an effort to avoid another Vietnam, and it succeeded. We haven't had another Vietnam in the sense that we haven't had any prolonged major military operation that wasn't approved by Congress until we got into the Arab Spring, the ISIS, Yemen issue. This is the first time that the war powers system hasn't worked, and that's because people have stretched the definitions under the 2001 AUMF. But it should be there. It should work, and it should work for future operations. So I think Congress is ready to hold future actions accountable. They don't seem to be ready to sort out what we should do in the ones that are current.
What do you think a future president needs to do to restore this balance? Well,
presidents have to understand the military and respect the military. The military has a great can-do spirit, but they also have a huge budget, which means everybody says, well, if we have a problem, let's use the military screwdriver rather than any other tool, or military hammer, I guess is a better metaphor. Use the military because we've got it, they're capable, they get things done, and we don't have enough money elsewhere, we don't have enough capability in the civilian sector, etc. That's a shame. They've got to rebalance our toolkit. We shouldn't be giving the military jobs that civilians should be doing, especially a lot of the State Department, USAID civilians.
In 2015, you wrote this chapter titled Congress and New Ways of War, in which you outline how Congress and the military have this partnership with supporting new technologies and new innovations. Right. What are your hopes for the future in regards to that partnership?
Well, I think one of the historical facts is that when Congress has wanted to be sure we had a certain kind of military technology or capability, they created a new entity to do it. They recognized that the existing armed forces, the existing bureaucracies would protect themselves and resist innovation. As I mentioned in that chapter, the Army, which controlled aviation until 1947, the U.S. Army resisted even attempting to look at heavier-than-air aircraft. The Wright brothers said, test our aircraft. It's a great thing. They resisted that until Senator Henry Cabot Lodge forced them to at least try out the Wright brothers' planes. Okay, Congress has often been the sponsor of the Mavericks with new technology, and I think that's why Congress created the Special Operations Command. That's why Congress is pushing for a stronger cyber command. I think that's a natural thing, and I'm glad that it's there because Congress often can identify things to do that the existing military resist because they know how to do their job well. They don't want anybody to mess with it.
So do you then advocate for Congress legislatively setting up a sixth branch of the military in charge of space operations?
I don't like that from what I've heard about it because it looks like too much duplication rather than specialization. I think the Air Force has done a pretty good job handling space, and I don't see offhand a reason other than, helping the uniform manufacturers have a new line to create a separate force.
Recently, we saw the somewhat dramatic resignation of Secretary Mattis from his post as Secretary of Defense. And the job of Secretary of Defense is something that you've written about extensively. What did you make of that sequence of events? His installation as Secretary of Defense as a retired general and his ensuing resignation?
I agreed that the existing law forbidding such a person, unless they've been out of uniform for at least 7 years, is a good law. I accepted Mattis appeared to be, especially in the Trump administration, a kind of once-a-generation exception that seemed acceptable. And I was disappointed by his performance in several regards. I hoped he would be more civilian. I'm told he basically got rid of the civilians in the front office of the secretary's retinue and replaced it with folks from his previous military command. He should have been he should have bent over backwards to deal with civilians as a civilian and not just to replicate his military success and devolve power to military subordinates. He should have tried to devolve power to civilian subordinates, and I don't think he did that well enough.
And what effect did that have or is going to have on civil-military relations?
Well, it means we still have unresolved tensions, and I do believe with Peter Feaver of Duke that our system builds in civilian control, but it has to be carefully managed. The civilians need to be respectful and understanding of the military, but the military needs to accept, as Feaver says, civilians have a right to be wrong. They don't have to accept all military advice. They should listen to it. They should weigh it. But the military should not have a veto over civilian policy choices, as I think is often the case in our country.
So we're here at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and we have a lot of classmates who are going to go into careers that have nothing to do with the military or national security, but they still might be influential someday at the federal level or the state level or the municipal level in policymaking. What do you think they should know about the military and national security policymaking?
Well, they should get to know individuals who are in uniform if they have opportunities. And usually the military is pretty good about providing visits to military installations. I've been on a carrier. I've been at a live fire exercise at Fort Benning. Of course, I was a Hill staffer. That made it easier. But they should look for opportunities to get behind the facade of the media and especially the movies, which project military members and military operations in too glossy and unrealistic a way. Okay, they should recognize they have ignorance and therefore they should seek to fill it. The same way they would about any big public policy issue or a foreign country that we have important relations with, they should seek out ways to do that and use folks like you as venues for broadening their understanding. And you, in later life as a commanding officer somewhere, should invite civil society to come aboard or in other ways engage with your units so they can understand them better.
Dr. Stevenson, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us today on Thank You for Your Service. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at TYFYS_podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get our next episode as soon as it's released.
Thank You for Your Service is produced by Haziano, Ashwarya Kumar, and Mary Martha McClay. Our publisher is David Raban. Special thanks to the University of Chicago Institute of Politics.